Thank you very much, Mr. Kinzer, for giving me a few minutes of your time. Could you speak about the current affairs, especially about this used car dealer who has turned out to be a gangster?
The history of American-Iranian relations is so distorted and so twisted, you are almost just waiting for something like this. Is there anything that hasn't happened? What hasn't happened? Okay, what hasn't happened is that we've got an assassination plot involving the Mexican drug mafia and somebody from Iran and some used car salesman in California. Now, we don't know the full story behind this or what the plot really was, but there's a larger story behind that, and that is competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran for hegemony in the Middle East. We're now seeing a very interesting situation in the Middle East. There's a power vacuum for the first time since the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the British were leaving the Middle East, so there was a power vacuum, and the Americans stepped in to fill that vacuum. Now, partly voluntarily and partly involuntarily, the Americans are leaving the Middle East, so that also leaves a power vacuum. Iran wants to fill it. Saudi Arabia also wants to fill it. So everything that is a clash between these two countries is played out against the background of this bigger rivalry.
So you bring Turkey in your recent article. Could you elaborate on your idea that Turkey is the role model for what's going on in the Middle East and for its future?
One of the interesting things about this conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia for leadership in the Middle East is that most people in the Middle East don't want either one. Most people living in Arab countries do not want to live like people in Iran, and they don't want to live like people in Saudi Arabia. Those are bad models. Those are repressive, outdated ideas of how to live. This effervescence in the Arab world is aimed at producing entirely different kinds of regimes. People don't want to be like Saudi Arabia, and they don't want to be like Iran. So, when they look around that region and they try to think, so what country in the Muslim Middle East looks like a country that we'd like our country to be like? How would we like to live? I think most of them would say, well, we'd like to live like Turks. What Turks have is a relatively open society, a democracy, it's a booming economy, good ties to the West, active foreign policy, and most of all, Turkey is setting an example. It's not that Turkey is seeking hegemony, but I think Turkey does have something to teach the rest of the Middle East. Now, the historical model is so different in Turkey from the Arab countries that I don't think most of the Arab countries can follow the Turkish model. It has taken Turkey 100 years to get to where it is. But in one way, I do think that there could be an example in Turkey for other Muslim countries in the Middle East, and that is the evolution of Islamic politics. Don't forget that in the mid-1990s, Islamic politics in Turkey was very radical. They even had this Islamist prime minister for 1 year. He wanted to pull Turkey out of NATO. They were going to create the Islamic NATO, the Islamic currency. They were going to radically break with the West, and that didn't last. That failed. So the Islamic political movement in Turkey had to look inward and ask themselves, what do we do if we want to appeal to a broad base? We have to change. So now you have in Turkey something unique in the Muslim world, which is the leading party with roots in Islamic politics is also the most pro-European, pro-Western, pro-capitalist, pro-democracy party in the country. Usually, we think of those as opposites. The Islamist party would be on one side, and the pro-capitalist, pro-European party would be on the other side. But this is one party, so Islamic politics has evolved in Turkey in a very interesting way. And although other countries might not be able to take Turkey as a model, other Islamist parties could take the Islamist party in Turkey as a model, and that would be good for everybody.
So Iran's losing a lot of influence in Middle East right now because of the uprising in the Arab country, because the model of Islamic Republic has come to an end. Could you elaborate about the uprising in Arab world and its influence on Iran and vice versa?
There are a number of differences between what happened in Iran, or what's happening in Iran, and what's happening in the Arab countries. I think one important part of this difference is that Iran has already had its revolution. People are always asking, so when is Iran having its revolution? And the answer is, that happened already. There isn't going to be another revolution in Iran, like what you're seeing now in, say, in Syria or what happened in Egypt. One thing I think is very positive about this, and this is one thing I admire about Iranians. I think Iran is in a post-utopian state. The ordinary Iranian is a post-utopian. And what I mean by that is, if you are living in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Libya, you have this utopian idea. There's 25 bad people in this country. They're oppressing us. Let's rise up. We'll get rid of those few bad people. And then everything will be beautiful, and it'll be democracy, and it'll be perfect. Iranians do not believe this. Iranians have learned very painfully that no matter how bad things are, they can always get worse. And I don't think people in the Arab countries have learned this very well. They are still utopians, and they have a lot of lessons to learn from the Iranian experience.
So I want to bring it to U.S.-Iran relationship, and it's been at odds for over 30 years, especially during the Bush era, and then Obama, when came to office, he mentioned that want to mend the issues, and he hasn't. And after 3 years, the situations are worse. Could you talk about the causes of why the relationship between Iran and U.S. are deteriorating worse than what they were?
It's really true that the Iran-U.S. relationship is probably the most conflicted relationship of any in the world. There's no two countries that have been at each other's throats this intensely for this long. It's an entirely dysfunctional relationship. And part of it is that the two sides are just talking past each other. They are on completely different vocabularies, different languages, different frames of mind. For Americans, we're still caught in the hostage incident. I mean, it's hard to believe, but even after decades have passed, we're still playing it over in our heads. And Iranians are thinking, on the contrary, that the hostage episode was just one small thing. And if you really want to get to the big moment that everything changed between the two countries, you have to go back to 1953 and see what happened with the overthrow of Mossadegh. That was the key incident. But Americans don't even know that ever happened. So our view of what went wrong with the U.S.-Iran relationship is totally different from the Iranian view. The positions have frozen so much that there are powerful factions in Washington and in Tehran that are against any reconciliation, because that will hurt them. In the case of Revolutionary Guards and others in Iran, it will hurt them not just politically, but financially, and even in their personal lives. So they can't support reconciliation. And there are people in Washington who, for various political reasons, some having to do with the Middle East, also don't want to see better relations between the U.S. and Iran. So these two groups, let's say the Ayatollahs in Tehran and the Ayatollahs in Washington, they're playing together, essentially, and they're being very successful. They are keeping these two countries apart when, in fact, over the long run, in terms of values, Iran and Iranians actually have more in common with the United States and Americans than most other people do in the Middle East have anything in common with us.
So could you suggest some ideas? Let's say administration in the U.S. and Iran's government are listening to you. They come to you to get advice. How to mend the situation? Give us 1, 2, 3.
I think there are a number of very accomplished senior diplomats in the United States. A number of them are recently retired, who are very eager to try to take on the Iran project. But they can't get a president of the United States that wants to send them to Iran. So I don't think that this problem is irreconcilable. In fact, I think it's inevitable, given interests, that the two countries will ultimately get back together. Iran and the United States have so many interests in common. The problem is that we haven't been able to get to the point where we're even talking about interests. We're still caught in the web of emotion. And emotion is always the enemy of good foreign policy making. So what I would like to see is a group of American diplomats, maybe retired diplomats with the endorsement of the government, try to make an effort to go to Iran and see what might be possible over there. And I'd say this, given what's happening in Iran right now, there may well be people who feel like being hostile to the United States is part of their existence. They need that in order to survive. That may be true, but we look back to all those years we coexisted with Soviet Russia. So we didn't like them and they didn't like us, but we had to find a way to manage our relationship. And we did. That's what we need to do with Iran. In the long run, maybe we can solve the problems that divide us. But in the shorter run, or the medium term, what we need to do is manage the relationship in ways so that it doesn't decline so seriously that we can get back to the point we were in at the end of the Bush years where it looked like we were almost about to go to war.
And give a message to the American citizens and Iranian citizens on the ground, not the governments.
I know Iranians and Americans have a great deal in common. Iranians are people that understand what democracy is much better than most of the other people in the Middle East. And Iranians are the population that is the most pro-American of any population in the world. I don't think maybe people realize the intense pro-American sentiment of people in Iran. Anyone that's been to Iran gets knocked out by this. It's amazing to see how intense it is. For Americans, it would be great to understand this fact, that actually the people of Iran are not little versions of those leaders of Iran that we see on our TV. Iran is a very sophisticated, vibrant society. It has a lot in common with American society. Let's try to get past the details of history that have separated us and see how much binds us together as peoples and as human beings.